Hello and welcome back to the History 2020 lecture series here at East Tennessee State University. In the lecture today, I want to talk to you about the so-called Interwar Period between the First and Second World Wars. Specifically, in this lecture, we'll look at the ways in which the United States and the world sought peace and order after the First World War. We'll also discuss the rise of totalitarian states and how their aggression threatened to break the peace. We'll explore how the European allies tried to use a policy of appeasement to try to stop the aggression, and we'll look at why this policy was a terrible failure. We'll also examine the rise of isolationism in the United States and the steps taken to prevent the country from being entangled in future overseas wars. Further, we'll talk about how that neutrality policy was tested. Finally, we'll discuss how the U.S. policy of neutrality was gradually eroded away with the outbreak of war in Europe. Additionally, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor will end any further discussion of neutrality. The mood after World War I had set the tone in the United States for resistance to international commitments. During the 20-year period between Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, the country sought to isolate itself from foreign entanglements. Nevertheless, it was virtually impossible for the United States to become completely isolated. American businesses had expanding worldwide connections. Investments and loans abroad put into circulation the American dollars, which enabled foreigners to purchase American exports. Also, America's overseas possessions directly involved the country in world affairs, especially in the Pacific. So a more accurate description of the interwar foreign policy is that of internationalism. That is, the United States sought to remain involved in the world's economy and with their overseas territories, yet try to steer clear of any military actions in Europe or in Asia. The interwar period was a time where many searched for peace and order in the world. World War I had essentially left Europe in a mess. Between 1914 and 1921, Europe suffered tens of millions of casualties from world war, epidemics, and famine. For instance, Germany and France alone lost nearly 10% of their workers. The American Relief Administration and private charities delivered food to needy Europeans. Through food relief, Americans hoped to stop any political radicalism that might take root in war-torn Europe. U.S. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes and other leaders expected U.S. economic expansion to promote international stability, believing that prosperity would eliminate ideological extremes, revolution, aggression, and war. Yet the type of collective security that Woodrow Wilson had envisioned with the creation of a League of Nations never really materialized. The League proved to be feeble, not only because the United States didn't join, but also because members failed to settle world disputes. After World War I, many Americans decided that the armaments race had actually caused the war, and that arms limitation treaties would bring lasting peace. Peace advocates influenced Warren G. Harding's administration to hold the Washington Naval Conference, and that took place from November 1921 to February 1922. Delegates from Great Britain, Japan, France, Italy, China, Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands joined the United States in talks to limit naval armaments. American leaders emphasized that the huge spending on building up the military might could actually hinder an economic recovery. Also, Secretary Hughes was concerned that a militaristic Japan, who had the third largest navy in the world, might overtake the United States, who was now ranked second behind Great Britain. So the delegates drew up stipulations to limit naval tonnage and to set a 10-year moratorium on the building of battleships and aircraft carriers. The idea of abolishing war altogether remained a popular concept after World War I. In 1928, these visions of world peace culminated in what was known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It originated when the French Foreign Minister Briand proposed to the U.S. Secretary of State Kellogg an agreement whereby the two countries would never go to war with each other. Kellogg countered the idea to have all nations sign the pact. The pact declared that signatories would, quote, condemn recourse to war and renounce it as an instrument of national policy. Eventually, 62 nations joined this pact, but all reserved, quote, self-defense as a type of disclaimer. For instance, the United States included a reservation declaring the Monroe Doctrine necessary to America's self-defense. And in speaking of the Monroe Doctrine, in Latin America, the spirit of peace and non-involvement helped relieve the long-term resentments against the United States, which had freely intervened in the Caribbean during the first 2 decades of the century. In 1930, President Hoover improved America's image in Latin America by permitting publication of a memorandum that denied the Monroe Doctrine justified U.S. intervention into Latin America. Before Hoover left office, he took steps to withdraw American forces from Haiti and Nicaragua, and this went a long way in trying to repair the relationship between the United States and Latin America. Franklin Roosevelt also supported this so-called good neighbor policy, and later supported a resolution declaring that, quote, no nation has the right to intervene in the internal or the external affairs of another. So now let's look at the rise of aggression in Europe and in Asia and how it threatened the world's security. As the Great Depression cut a destructive path through the international economy, the peoples of other nations turned to political extremism. Totalitarian governments were established in the Soviet Union, Germany, and Italy. Also, the rise of Japanese militarists paralleled the rise of the totalitarian states. Dictatorship was by no means a new phenomenon, but the modern totalitarian state was. During the Interwar Period, totalitarian regimes extended the functions and power of the state far beyond what they had ever been in the past. Italy and Germany yielded to a political movement known as fascism, while Soviet Russia installed a communist regime. The immediate origins of totalitarianism can be found in the total warfare of World War I, when governments exercised controls over economic, political, and personal freedoms in order to achieve victory. The modern totalitarian state, however, moved beyond the ideal of passive obedience expected in a traditional dictatorship or an authoritarian monarchy. The total state aimed to control not only the economic, political, and social aspects of life, but the intellectual and cultural aspects as well. That control, however, had a specific purpose: the active involvement of the masses in the achievement of the regime's goals, which could include anything from war to building a thousand-year Reich. The modern totalitarian state was headed up by a single leader and a single party. It rejected the ideal of limited government. It also rejected the ideal of constitutional guarantees of individual freedoms. Moreover, individual freedom was to be subordinate to the collective will of the masses, organized and determined for them by an overall leader. The state used mass propaganda techniques to literally conquer the minds of the people. In the early 1920s, Benito Mussolini, or Il Duce, of Italy, took advantage of the economic turmoil, political disorder, and general insecurity to install a fascist government. Joseph Stalin in 1924 set himself up as leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Vladimir Lenin. Stalin used the army as well as terror tactics in order to secure control. Adolf Hitler in 1933 became Chancellor of Germany and eventually gained dictatorial powers, bringing the National Socialist, or the Nazi Party, to power. Taking the title Der Führer, or the sole and supreme national leader, Hitler capitalized on the German people's resentment of the Versailles Treaty. He also used the inability of Germany's democratic government, the Weimar Republic, to control the runaway inflation of the 1920s. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, was Hitler's political manifesto, and it was published in 1923. It detailed Hitler's goals, and this included his desire for territorial expansion to the east and the elimination of the Jews, whom he blamed for all of Germany's troubles. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler's brutal Nazi police state utilized terrorism, propaganda, and censorship in the quest for unconditional obedience from the people. In Japan, the rise of militarism resulted not from a seizure of power by a new political party, but from the growing influence of militant forces at the top of the political hierarchy. So now let's look at how this rising aggression in Europe and Asia threatened the peace. The 1930s witnessed a chain of events in Asia and in Europe that seemingly signaled the world was headed once more for disaster. In 1934, Japan renounced its agreement to reduce its naval power and began an aggressive military buildup in the anticipation of expanding its control in Asia. In 1935, Mussolini launched a conquest of Ethiopia in eastern Africa, while Hitler, in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty, announced that he was revitalizing Germany's armed forces. The next year, Hitler blatantly violated the treaty once again by sending 35,000 German troops into the Rhineland, and this was the demilitarized buffer zone between France and Germany. As a result, the French took no actions. In fact, no one took any actions against this violation of the treaty. And this was key because Hitler now confirmed that the Western democracies would not stand in the way of his aggressive plans. In fact, Hitler admitted that his show of force was in fact a bluff, and he stated that, quote, if the French had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. So Hitler now knows the Western Allies are not going to stand in his way. Also, in 1936, a civil war erupted in Spain against the newly democratically elected government. Hostilities began with Spanish troops loyal to General Francisco Franco when they revolted against the Spanish government. Hitler and Mussolini both sent troops, warplanes, and massive amounts of military and financial aid to support Franco in his fascist uprising. Franco prevailed, and he ruled Spain from 1939 until his death in 1975. So at the same time fascism was spreading across Europe, the Japanese clashed with China that resulted in a full-scale war in 1937. The Japanese army captured the nationalist Chinese capital of Nanjing, and the undisciplined Japanese soldiers began to terrorize the Chinese people, murdering and raping large numbers of Chinese. Tens of thousands of civilians were murdered in what came to be called the Rape of Nanjing. In the meantime, peace in Europe continued to unravel. In 1937, Italy joined Germany and Japan in establishing the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Now, to all these events that were occurring, France and Great Britain responded with a policy of appeasement. Astonishing as it might sound, the Allies believed if they gave in to Hitler's demands that he would eventually go away. The policy of appeasement eventually proved to be terribly disastrous. Hitler continually took advantage of the caution of the Allies, and he continually raised his demands. Now having rebuilt the German military, Hitler ordered the troops into neighboring Austria. He proposed that Germany be allowed to annex Austria, which in fact was the country of his birth. The Austrians for the most part welcomed Hitler's army, and they had no problems with the proposed Anschluss, or union, with Germany. There was also an almost shrugging of the shoulders response from the Western Allies as they justified the action, saying, aren't they all Germans anyway, so what's the harm? Again, Hitler upped the ante, so to speak, and in September 1938, he demanded that the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia become a part of Germany. He argued that there were nearly 3 million ethnic Germans in comparison to the 700,000 Czechs living in the region, so therefore it should be a part of Germany. The Sudeten region also provided vital defenses for the rest of Czechoslovakia, which is important to remember. France and Britain both agreed to send representatives to Munich in September 1938 to meet with Hitler. Later called the Munich Conference, this meeting represents the climax of the policy of appeasement. At the Munich Conference, the French and the British, without really ever consulting the Czechs, agreed to let Hitler have this one last demand. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home to Britain proclaiming peace in our time. There's a very famous film footage of Chamberlain getting off his plane, showing a piece of paper. He's waving a piece of paper in which he claims that he's established peace. On this paper, this agreement, Hitler had promised that after getting the Sudeten region, he would take no more territory. The so-called peace in our time lasted exactly 6 months, because in March 1939, Hitler took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Ironically, the emergence of political extremism in Europe produced no widespread call in the United States for any type of collective security or joint international action. Instead, it actually encouraged a rise in isolationist sentiment. American leaders sought to strengthen democracy at home rather than to commit U.S. resources abroad. So now let's look at the United States and its commitment to neutrality and the ways in which this neutrality was tested. In 1934 and 1935, Senator Gerald Nye, a North Dakota Republican, conducted a Senate investigation into the reasons why the United States became involved into World War I. Nye's committee concluded that war profiteers, whom they called merchants of death, had maneuvered the United States into a war to save their investments. This included bankers, businessmen, and arms dealers who had made scandalous profits from the war. So during the 1930s, the United States moved toward complete isolation from the quarrels of Europe. And to that end, President Roosevelt in 1935 signed the first of several neutrality laws. The laws were intended to prevent the kind of entanglements which had drawn the United States into World War I. The Neutrality Act of 1935 prohibited Americans from traveling on ships owned by nations at war. It also forbade any arms sales to a country where a state of war existed. So when Italy invaded Ethiopia, Roosevelt invoked the Neutrality Act, but the law, it was discovered, didn't cover war-related materials such as oil, steel, and copper. So in 1936, Congress revised the Neutrality Law, and they also forbade any loans to those countries who were at war. Then in the spring of 1937, Congress passed another neutrality law, which allowed the president to require that goods, other than munitions and arms, exported to those countries who were at war, be sold on what was called a cash and carry basis. That is, a nation would have to pay cash and then carry the supplies away on its own ships. Cash and carry was intended to preserve a profitable trade without running the risk of war. So these new neutrality laws faced a test in 1937 when Japanese and Chinese forces clashed in China. Since neither side had formally declared war, Roosevelt did not invoke the neutrality laws. If he had, it would have favored the Japanese and penalized the supply-dependent nationalist Chinese. On December 12, 1937, Japanese planes sank the U.S. gunboat Panay, which had been anchored in China on the Yangtze River, prominently flying the U.S. flag. Surprisingly, the sinking of the Panay generated only a few calls for retaliation in the United States. In fact, a Texas congressman said this incident should lead to the withdrawal of U.S. troops, a Texas congressman said this incident should lead to the withdrawal of the U.S. altogether from China, saying, quote, "We should learn that it's about time to mind our own business." This incident clearly illustrates how strong the commitment in the United States was to neutrality and its desire for isolation. Roosevelt was concerned that the United States could not continue to keep its back turned on an increasingly turbulent world. In October 1937, he gave a speech in Chicago in which he called for international cooperation to, quote, "quarantine the aggressors who were disturbing the world peace." This was a significant speech in that Chicago represented the heartland of isolationism. Nevertheless, Roosevelt's appeal for a broader American role in world affairs fell flat in Congress and across the nation. A survey at the time revealed that nearly 70% of Americans wanted all U.S. citizens to be removed from China in order to prevent a possible incident that might trigger a war. Roosevelt, however, was growing increasingly concerned about the need to contain aggressive militarism displayed by Japan and Germany. So now let's look at how this neutrality stance by the United States was slowly eroded away through world events. After Hitler's troops defiantly occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in 1939, Roosevelt abandoned his neutral stance. In his mind, Hitler could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, Hitler now set his sights on Germany's eastern neighbor, Poland. He had long dreamed of Germany acquiring Lebensraum, or living space, in the east. Modern Poland at this time had only existed for 20 years, The Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I had created it. To ensure that the Soviet Union did not interfere with his plans to conquer Poland, Hitler secured an agreement with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. Known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, Hitler and Stalin secretly agreed to divide up Northern and Eastern Europe between themselves. And this cleared the way for Hitler to attack Poland without risking a war with the Soviets. At this time, Hitler all along had plans to eventually launch an attack against the Soviet Union, but he wanted to take the French and the British out first in order to avoid fighting a two-front war. A few days later, Hitler's secret police, the Gestapo, concocted a plan to make it appear as if the Poles had actually attacked Germany, thereby giving Hitler a reason to invade Poland, as if he really needed one. On September 1st, 1939, 1.5 million German troops with thousands of tanks and armored vehicles invaded Poland. Hitler ordered his troops to, quote, kill without mercy men, women, and children of the Polish race or language. As a result of the action, Great Britain and France honored their commitment to declare war if Poland was attacked by Germany. So by September the 3rd, 1939, Europe was at war once again. Now, it would take weeks for the British and the French to mobilize their troops, and they hoped that the declaration of war would cause Hitler to pull back, but he did not. Instead, Germans began to massacre the Poles, and as German forces pushed into Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The Polish army, outnumbered and poorly equipped, had no choice but to surrender. Poland was divided among the Germans and the Soviets, and thereafter some 2 million Poles were arrested, enslaved, or just outright murdered. Roosevelt responded to the outbreak of war in Europe by proclaiming U.S. neutrality. In September 1937, Roosevelt summoned Congress into a special session to revise the Neutrality Acts. In this special session, Roosevelt said, quote, "I regret that Congress passed the act, and I regret equally that I signed the act." Under the revised Neutrality Act of 1939, Britain and France were now allowed to send their own ships to the United States in order to purchase military supplies. American public opinion supported this measure, but they did not want to be involved in fighting another European war. After the German conquest of Poland, the war in Europe settled into a stalemate during early 1940 that was called the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg. During this time, many Americans were lulled into thinking that military supplies would be enough to help the Allies defeat Hitler. Hitler, however, soon shattered that line of thinking during the spring of 1940. On April 9, 1940, without any warning, the Nazi Blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare, overran the country of Denmark within a few hours. This type of warfare featured carefully coordinated columns of very fast-moving German tanks, motorized artillery, and infantry, all supported by warplanes. After taking Denmark, the Nazis moved quickly to take Norway, Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. Next, the Germans stormed into France, sending the Allied troops into a frantic retreat to the coast at Dunkirk. The Germans missed an opportunity to inflict a crushing defeat on the Allies when Hitler suddenly ordered the German units to stop, rest, and refuel. His generals were furious that Hitler had halted the attack, but they did as they were ordered to. This brief break gave the British and the French troops time to evacuate across the English Channel. The British government enlisted every available boat ferrying more than 300,000 Allied troops from France to England. The new Prime Minister of England, Winston Churchill, called the rescue effort, quote, "a miracle of deliverance." Meanwhile, the German army took control of France, and by June 14, 1940, the German swastika flag was flying over Paris. A few days later, French leaders were forced to surrender to Hitler in the same railroad car in which Germany had been forced to surrender in 1918. The fall of France was a devastating blow that left Great Britain standing alone against the Nazi threat of world domination. Winston Churchill appealed to Roosevelt for help as Hitler began preparations to invade Great Britain. Churchill had vowed to the British people that Britain would, quote, "go on to the end," declaring, "We shall never surrender. We shall fight on, forever and ever and ever." In response to Churchill's request of military supplies, Roosevelt promised to provide all possible aid to the Allies short of war. In June 1940, Roosevelt set up the National Defense Research Committee to coordinate military research, including the top-secret effort to develop an atomic bomb. Famous physicist Albert Einstein, a Jewish Austrian refugee, had alerted Roosevelt in the fall of 1939 that the Germans were trying to create atomic bombs. At this time, the U.S. began researching plans for an atomic bomb, but it was so top secret that only a few people actually knew. Even members of Roosevelt's closest advisors did not know about the plans for an atomic bomb. During July and August of 1940, Hitler began launching bombing raids over Britain in an attempt to knock out military targets such as ships, naval bases, warplanes, and airfields. The so-called Battle of Britain had begun. The British Royal Air Force, the RAF, benefited from a new technology known as radar. This allowed the RAF to fend off German air assaults. So not making much headway, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe, his air force, to begin bombing factories, civilian areas, and cities, in particular bombing London. This type of terror bombing, especially nighttime raids, was designed to break the British morale. In what came to be known as the Blitz of London, during September and October of 1940, the Germans caused massive destruction to Britain's major cities. Large areas of London lay in ruins from the attacks. The raids also killed over 40,000 British civilians, but instead of breaking their spirit, the Germans succeeded in only enraging the British people. Meanwhile, German submarine attacks on British ships strained the resources flowing into Britain from the United States. Roosevelt responded with an executive order through which 50 old U.S. destroyers went to the British in return for leases to 8 British naval bases in the Caribbean. Then on September 16, 1940, Roosevelt signed the first peacetime conscription in American history, requiring registration of some 16 million men aged 21 to 35. Americans who supported isolation protested these actions taken by Roosevelt. For instance, the America First Committee argued that while the Nazi aggression was certainly distasteful, it posed no direct threat to America's security. Throughout the fall of 1940, Roosevelt spoke of the need for a huge foreign aid program to help Great Britain fight the Nazis. Roosevelt justified this stance as a way to keep the United States out of the war by enabling the British to win. In November 1940, Roosevelt stood successfully for re-election over Republican candidate Wendell Willkie. Willkie had warned that Roosevelt was a warmonger, and if the American people re-elected him, he said, "You may expect war in April 1941. To this, Roosevelt responded, quote, "I have said this before and I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent to any foreign wars." After securing re-election, Roosevelt continued to provide military aid to Great Britain, whose cash was quickly running out. So the president devised a plan that would allow the United States to loan military weapons to Great Britain because their cash was running short. The so-called Lend-Lease Bill was introduced into Congress in early 1941, which would authorize the president to lend or lease military equipment to, quote, "any country whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States." Roosevelt explained it was like lending your neighbor a garden hose when his house is on fire. Isolationists nonetheless were furious with this bill, and for 2 months a bitter debate raged in Congress. However, in March 1941, Lend-Lease was passed. And to ensure safe delivery of the goods, Roosevelt ordered the Navy to patrol halfway across the Atlantic, and he sent troops to Greenland and Iceland. Now, while the United States was debating neutrality, the European war continued to expand. Italy officially entered the war in June 1940 as Germany's ally. In the spring of 1941, German and Italian troops invaded Libya and forced the British Army in North Africa to pull back to Egypt. Also in the spring of 1941, the Nazis overtook Yugoslavia, Greece, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Hitler now controlled nearly all of Europe, but he was not finished. His original plan was to defeat France and Britain first and then turn and attack the Soviet Union. He wanted to avoid what he considered the fatal flaw of World War I, and that was fighting a two-front war. However, while Britain was on the ropes, so to speak, the country had not been conquered, and Hitler repeated the same mistake by going ahead and attacking the Soviet Union. In the early morning hours of June 22, 1941, without any warning, the German army suddenly invaded the Soviet Union. Known as Operation Barbarossa, one of Hitler's goals was to expand east for living space and also at the same time wipe out the Jewish population, which was very heavy in the eastern regions of Europe. Hitler now must fight a two-front war. Roosevelt began talking of the importance of sending Lend-Lease aid to the Soviets. He argued that if Soviet troops could hold off the Germans, that it would give the British some well-needed breathing time. By November 1941, Lend-Lease aid was flowing to the Russians, and Churchill, who despised the communists, applauded the aid and said, quote, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly off the coast of Newfoundland for 4 days. During this meeting, they drafted what was later called the Atlantic Charter. It was a joint statement of common principles that established a mutual idea of a post-war world, many of which were based on the old Wilsonian principles. It pledged that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, the victors would promote self-determination of all peoples, economic cooperation, freedom of the seas, and a new system of international security. So you can see how very similar it was to Wilson's 14 points. By September 1941, 11 nations, including the Soviet Union, had endorsed the Atlantic Charter. In the meantime, Roosevelt authorized naval patrols in September 1941 to shoot on sight all German vessels operating between the United States and Iceland. So it's not going to be long before there's shooting incidents between the U.S. ships and German U-boats in the North Atlantic. On October 17, 1941, while the destroyer Kearney was attacking German submarines, it was hit by a German torpedo and 11 lives were lost. 2 weeks later, a German submarine sank the destroyer Reuben James with a loss of 115 seamen. The attacks caused Congress to change the 1939 Neutrality Act by repealing the bans on arming merchant vessels and allowing them to enter combat zones and the ports of nations at war. Effectively, by late 1941, the United States had given up neutrality and embarked on a naval warfare against Nazi Germany. However, Americans still hoped to avoid taking that final step into all-out war. Ironically, though, with the situation in Europe, the decision to enter the war would come to the United States by way of Asia. So let's look at how the United States became involved in World War II. By 1940, the United States' relationship with Japan had gradually worsened, pushing the two nations closer to war. In September 1940, Americans were alarmed to learn that Japan had joined Italy and Germany in a military alliance. In July 1941, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam. Roosevelt responded by freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. He also restricted oil exports to Japan, and he merged the armed forces in the Philippines with the United States Army, placing General Douglas MacArthur in charge of all U.S. forces in East Asia. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded that Japan withdraw its forces from French Indochina and China. Japan, by 1941, had now committed itself to a war with the United States if the embargo was not lifted. Japanese military leaders began plotting a surprise attack on U.S. bases in Hawaii. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese war minister, realized that Japan could not win a prolonged war, and a surprise attack on the naval base in Hawaii could effectively cripple the United States. Officials in Washington, believing that war was imminent, sent warnings to U.S. commanders in all the Pacific of a possible Japanese attack. However, no one really expected the Japanese to launch a surprise attack over 3,000 miles away at Hawaii's Pearl Harbor. Yet, in the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, Japanese planes began bombing the unsuspecting American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Of the 8 American battleships, all were sunk or disabled, along with 11 other ships. At airfields on the islands, the Japanese bombers destroyed 180 American airplanes. The raid, which lasted less than 2 hours, killed more than 2,400 American servicemen and civilians, and wounded nearly 1,200 more. But the surprise attack fell short of total success in some important ways. Japanese bombers neglected to destroy onshore facilities and oil tanks which supported the U.S. fleet. The bombers also missed the American aircraft carriers that had left port a few days earlier. In the war to come, aircraft carriers would prove to be a very decisive weapon. In a larger sense, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a great miscalculation. Instead of demoralizing Americans, it awakened a desire in them to wage total war against Japan. The attack on December 7th effectively silenced America's debate on neutrality. The next day, Roosevelt delivered his war message to Congress saying, quote, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." Congress voted for war almost unanimously. The only exception was Representative from Montana, Janet Rankin, who was a pacifist, and I guess she was just being consistent because she also voted against war in 1917. On December the 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. So the wars being waged by armies in Asia, Europe, and Africa had now become a global war.